The sharp, metallic clang of the alarm echoed in the dimly lit apartment, breaking the tranquil silence of a Chicago morning. Sarah Monroe, a distinguished African American judge, stirred from her sleep, blinking her eyes to adjust to the soft light filtering through the blinds. The day ahead loomed large in her mind, a pivotal moment in her career, one that could shift the public perception of justice in the city. The scent of fresh coffee wafted through the cozy apartment as Sarah prepared her morning brew. Her kitchen, a reflection of her meticulous nature, was spotless. The shelves were lined with cookbooks and legal texts, and the walls adorned with family photos capturing moments of joy and resilience. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting to the trial she was about to preside over, a high-profile corruption case that had gripped the city's attention. With her coffee in hand, she sat by her kitchen table, glancing over the neatly organized documents. Her laptop screen glowed with notes and briefs, reminders of the countless hours she had poured into understanding every nuance of the case. But despite her thorough preparation, a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. Today wasn't just about delivering justice, it was about proving her worth in a system that often questioned her legitimacy. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her sister Lisa, the one person who had always been her unwavering support. "Good morning, Sarah. Are you ready for today?" Lisa's voice was warm and comforting. Sarah exhaled, a slight smile playing on her lips. "As ready as I can be. It's a big day." "You've got this," Lisa reassured her. "Remember who you are. You didn't get here by chance. You earned it." Sarah nodded, the words resonating deeply. Memories of her early struggles in law school resurfaced, the whispered doubts about her abilities, the subtle and not so subtle biases she had faced. But she had persevered, fueled by a determination to excel, to prove that she belonged in spaces where she was often the only person of color. After ending the call, Sarah dressed with precision, donning a tailored gray business suit that exuded both professionalism and authority. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman of grace and strength, someone who had weathered countless storms. "You've got this," she whispered to herself before stepping out into the brisk Chicago air. Across town, John Daniels, a seasoned courthouse security officer, stood at his post, his expression stern. His uniform was immaculate, a badge of pride he wore daily. But beneath the polished exterior lay a man shaped by biases and preconceived notions. He had seen judges come and go, and in his mind, they all fit a particular mold, one that Sarah Monroe did not. Daniels' younger colleague, Mike Carter, joined him at the checkpoint. "Big day today," Mike remarked. "Judge Monroe's presiding over that corruption case." Daniels' lips curled into a smirk. "Monroe? That black female judge? I don't get it. How did she land such a major case?" Mike frowned, uneasy with the comment. "She's one of the best judges in the state. People respect her." Daniels shrugged dismissively. "Respect doesn't mean much these days. People get ahead for all sorts of reasons." As Sarah approached the courthouse, her steps were measured, deliberate. Her heels clicked against the pavement, a rhythmic sound that echoed her resolve. The courthouse, a grand structure with towering columns, loomed ahead, a symbol of justice and authority. At the checkpoint, Daniels noticed her approaching. His eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. Sarah offered a polite nod as she placed her bag on the conveyor belt and approached the metal detector. "ID," Daniels demanded curtly, his tone devoid of warmth. Sarah raised an eyebrow but complied, retrieving her judicial ID from her bag. She handed it to Daniels, who scrutinized it with exaggerated care, flipping it over as if searching for a flaw. "A judge, huh?" he sneered. "You don't look like a judge." Sarah's gaze remained steady, unflinching. "And what does a judge look like, in your opinion?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with an edge. Daniels ignored the question, pointing to a secondary screening area. "Step over here. I need to conduct additional checks." Mike Carter intervened, his tone respectful but firm. "She's Judge Monroe. There's no need for extra checks." Daniels shot him a warning glance. "Protocol is protocol. Let me do my job." Sarah stepped aside, her expression composed. She was no stranger to such treatment. Throughout her career, she had faced countless instances where her authority was questioned, not because of her qualifications, but because of her appearance. "I've presented valid identification," Sarah stated. "What grounds do you have for requesting further checks?" Daniels crossed his arms. Just being thorough. Some people like to pose as important figures to bypass security. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, her patience wearing thin. Ensure that you apply the same standard to everyone, Officer Daniels. Fairness is, after all, the cornerstone of justice. The exchange drew attention from onlookers, staff members, attorneys, and even a few journalists lingering near the entrance. Whispers spread through the crowd, the tension palpable. Mike Carter, sensing the growing unease, tried once more to reason with Daniels. You're overstepping. This isn't how we treat our judges. But Daniels, driven by ego and perhaps something more insidious, refused to relent. If she's a judge, she has nothing to worry about. Sarah stood tall, her demeanor unwavering. She had faced far worse than a prejudiced security officer. Her patience was her armor, and she wielded it with grace. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniels handed back her ID. You're clear to go. Sarah took her ID, her gaze lingering on Daniels for a moment. Thank you, Officer Daniels. I trust you'll be equally thorough with everyone today. As she walked away, the weight of the encounter settled on her shoulders. But she didn't let it deter her. She had a job to do, and she would do it with the integrity and diligence that had defined her career. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Reporters jostled for positions, eager to capture the story of the day. Sarah entered the courtroom, her presence commanding respect. The whispers and doubts faded away as she took her place on the bench. Outside, John Daniels stood at his post, his mind replaying the encounter. Unbeknownst to him, the incident had been witnessed by several individuals who would later report his behavior. His actions would spark conversations about implicit bias and the need for reforms in courthouse security protocols. As the trial commenced, Sarah Monroe's voice rang out, steady and resolute. She was a beacon of justice in a world that often sought to undermine her. And though she carried the scars of prejudice, she remained undeterred, knowing that every step she took paved the way for a more equitable future. Every action Daniels took seemed meticulously calculated to assert his dominance over the situation, but Sarah, unflinching, refused to let his behavior intimidate her. His every gesture, every lingering glance at her identification card, seemed an attempt to undermine her authority. Yet, rather than react, she allowed her mind to drift back to the moments that had shaped her resilience, the experiences that had carved her into the formidable woman standing before him now. Her memories pulled her back to her early days at a prestigious law school, where she had been one of the very few black students in her class. She could still vividly recall walking into the lecture hall for the first time, feeling the weight of countless eyes tracking her every move. Though no one spoke outright, the silent judgment was palpable. Their gazes questioned her very presence, as though she didn't belong, as though she had somehow trespassed into a world not meant for her. During one particular discussion on criminal law, Sarah had poured her heart into presenting a well-researched, sharp argument that drew on both precedent and innovative thought. Yet instead of praise, the professor's dismissive tone cut through her confidence. An interesting perspective, he remarked, his voice laced with condescension. But perhaps not very practical. The room fell silent. The embarrassment was immediate and searing. She could feel her face flush, her heart pounding in her chest. But instead of succumbing to shame, she steeled herself. This was not the first time she'd been underestimated, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. That day, Sarah made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let prejudice define her. Instead, she would work harder, dig deeper, and rise higher. She buried herself in legal texts and case law, spending countless hours in the library, not just to complete assignments but to arm herself with knowledge that would render her undeniable. By the end of the term, her final paper received the highest marks in the class. Even the dismissive professor had no choice but to acknowledge her intellect, though he did so begrudgingly, never openly admitting he'd been wrong. Her journey of perseverance continued into her professional life. As the only black woman in her group of interns at a prestigious law firm, she found herself frequently overlooked. In meetings, critical tasks were assigned to her peers, while she was left with administrative work that barely scratched the surface of her capabilities. One afternoon, as she passed by the break room, she overheard a conversation between two of her male colleagues. "She's only here because of the diversity quotas," one of them scoffed. "I doubt she can handle anything important." Their words stung, but Sarah refused to let them see her pain. Instead, she turned their doubt into fuel. A week later, her team was assigned a high-stakes case. While her colleagues celebrated the weekend, Sarah spent her nights at her desk, preparing a comprehensive legal brief that addressed every possible angle of the case. When she presented her analysis, the room fell silent once more, this time not out of dismissal, but out of sheer respect for her thoroughness and insight. Though the team leader, a middle-aged white man, took the credit for the success, Sarah knew her work had spoken volumes. Slowly but surely, perceptions began to shift. Her talent and determination were becoming impossible to ignore. Her memories drifted to her campaign for the bench. It had been a grueling process, not just because of the political pressures that came with running for office, but because of the constant, insidious biases she had to confront along the way. Online forums buzzed with harsh comments questioning her qualifications. "She's just a token choice," one particularly cruel post read. Another box checked off. These remarks weren't new to Sarah, but this time, the prejudice felt amplified, magnified by the reach of social media. She could have responded, defended herself against the baseless accusations, but she chose a different path. She let her accomplishments speak for her. Throughout her campaign, she highlighted her years of experience, her record of presiding over hundreds of cases, and her unwavering commitment to justice and equality under the law. Ultimately, Sarah won the election, not because of her image or any political alliances, but because of her undeniable capabilities. On the day of her appointment, even her harshest critics had no choice but to concede that she deserved the position. Back in the present, Sarah straightened her posture, her gaze locked on Daniels. His eyes darted from her ID to his scanner, his body language betraying his discomfort. Yet his defiance remained. "We need more time," he stated, his tone deliberately provocative. Sarah didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her eyes conveying a clear message. "You can doubt me, but you will never break me." Daniels continued his unnecessary scrutiny of her ID, his fingers tracing the edges as if hoping to find a flaw that would justify his actions. The tension at the security checkpoint was palpable. His colleagues stood by, silent witnesses to the unfolding standoff, too uneasy or unwilling to intervene. "This ID," Daniels said finally, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "It doesn't look very official. Where'd you get it? Some online shop?" A faint scoff came from one of the other officers but was quickly silenced by Sarah's piercing stare. She remained calm, her voice steady as she responded. "If you can't recognize a legitimate state-issued ID, then perhaps you should revisit your training." Daniels faltered for a moment but quickly recovered, his smug demeanor returning. "You're good at talking your way out of things, aren't you? But this is a secure area, and I'm in charge here. If you want to get through, I need to make sure everything checks out." Sarah took a slow, measured breath. She knew what she was dealing with, a man clinging to authority, desperate to assert control. Instead of losing her composure, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small black device, a compact voice recorder. She pressed the record button, the soft beep echoing in the tense silence. Daniels's expression shifted from smugness to unease. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I'm recording this exchange," Sarah replied, her gaze never wavering. "Because if your actions are legitimate and based on proper protocol, you should have nothing to worry about. But if not, this will serve as clear evidence of your misuse of authority." The tension thickened. Daniel stared at the recorder, his discomfort growing. One of the other officers, Mike Carter, exhaled sharply and shook his head, a subtle signal that things had gone too far. "You think you can threaten me with that recorder?" Daniels shot back, his voice louder but less convincing. "Then go ahead and do it," Sarah said evenly. "Verify my ID. But remember, every word you speak and every action you take will be reviewed by your superiors. And perhaps even the courts." The mounting pressure was evident in Daniels's shifting stance. His colleagues exchanged glances, some clearly disapproving of his handling of the situation. Finally, Mike Carter stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "Daniels, you should stop. This is Judgment Row. We all know who she is. Don't make this worse." Daniels turned toward Mike, his face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "You trying to tell me how to do my job?" Mike didn't flinch. "I'm telling you to do it right." Sarah remained composed, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. No one is questioning your authority, she said. But when you wield it against me without cause, it's no longer about security, it's discrimination. And I will make sure that doesn't go unnoticed. Her words struck Daniels like a blade. His grip on her ID tightened, but his confidence wavered. The air around them grew heavier as the silence stretched. Finally, Daniels muttered something under his breath and returned her ID, though he hesitated. I need to run one more check, he said, clearly stalling. Sarah stepped forward, her presence commanding. You can continue doing what you think is necessary. But remember, fairness isn't optional. It's mandatory. And I'm here to ensure it. The woman standing before Daniels exuded a quiet strength, her posture upright, her gaze steady. The tense atmosphere at the security checkpoint began to shift, the ripple effect of discomfort and curiosity spreading through the courthouse lobby. Several bystanders had taken notice of the scene, their murmurs growing louder as the confrontation dragged on. Court employees, lawyers, and even civilians waiting to enter the courthouse gathered, their curious and skeptical gazes fixed on the unfolding situation. It didn't take long for someone to pull out their phone and start recording. The subtle sound of a camera app opening was unmistakable in the otherwise silent lobby. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. What's going on here? One person murmured to a colleague, nudging them to look. Isn't that Judge Monroe? Why is she being treated like this? Sarah Monroe stood her ground, her unwavering eyes locked on Daniels, who stubbornly clung to his clipboard and ego. She could sense the shift in the air. The balance of power, initially tilted in Daniels' favor as the uniformed officer in charge, was beginning to tip against him. The stares directed at him were no longer indifferent. They carried weight, disapproval, disbelief, and growing impatience. Despite the change, Daniels seemed oblivious. His grip on the clipboard tightened, and his jaw clenched in determination. He was a man who had built his authority on small acts of control and wasn't about to let go easily. Mike Carter, who had stepped in earlier to try to defuse the situation, approached Daniels once more. His tone was firmer this time, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had seen enough. Daniels, you need to stop, Mike said, his voice cutting through the low hum of whispers around them. This isn't right. What you're doing has gone too far. People are watching. This isn't protocol anymore. This is something else entirely. Daniels' head snapped around, his eyes narrowing in anger. Shut your mouth, he snapped at Mike, his voice trembling slightly, betraying his frustration. Who do you think you are? I'm in charge here, not you. This is my checkpoint. Mike took a step back but didn't retreat entirely. His gaze flickered to Sarah, standing calm and composed despite the hostility directed at her. There was a flicker of sympathy in his eyes as he spoke again, more quietly but no less resolutely. Judge Monroe, I'm sorry for this inconvenience, Mike said, inclining his head respectfully. I'll make sure this gets reported to the proper authorities. Daniels spun back around, his face contorted with anger. I don't need you apologizing for me. He barked. This is my job, and I'm following protocol. If you don't like it, you can leave. From the crowd, a new voice cut through the tension. Proper protocol? A woman asked, stepping forward. She appeared to be a lawyer, her tailored suit and briefcase suggesting a familiarity with courthouse proceedings. Her expression was incredulous. I've worked in this courthouse for years, and I've never seen a judge treated like this. This isn't protocol. This is an abuse of power. Murmurs spread once again. More people began to speak up, emboldened by the lawyer's words. That's right, a court employee added. I've never seen anything like this happen before. Judge Monroe has always been treated with respect. Why is this happening now? Daniels turned toward the crowd, his irritation now evident in every movement. Everyone, mind your business, he snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. Nobody asked for your opinions. But his voice lacked the authority it once carried. He could feel the crowd turning against him, and it made his skin crawl. His gaze flickered nervously from one onlooker to the next, lingering on the phones recording his every move. Sarah remained steady, her voice calm but resonant as she addressed the gathering crowd. Thank you for your concern, she said, her tone carrying a quiet grace. Justice will always come to light, and wrongful actions will be held accountable. Her words hung in the air, adding to the mounting pressure on Daniels. His fists clenched at his sides, his face growing redder by the second. He glanced toward Mike, who stood with his arms crossed, no longer willing to back down. From the crowd, a young man raised his phone higher and called out, "This needs to be documented. He needs to be held accountable. I'm recording all of this." Daniels' shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn to address the comment. Instead, he focused on Sarah, who now stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Do you intend to continue stalling?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp and deliberate. "Or will you do the right thing and return my ID?" Daniels didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked between Sarah, the crowd, and the phones pointed at him. He could feel his authority slipping away, his control crumbling beneath the weight of public scrutiny. "I don't need anyone telling me how to do my job," Daniels muttered through clenched teeth. He still held Sarah's ID in his hand, gripping it like a lifeline. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "If you truly believe you're following the correct protocol," she said evenly, "then call your superior. I'm certain they'll back you up if your actions are justified." Daniels hesitated. Her words struck a nerve, and he knew it. But instead of conceding, he crossed his arms defensively. "That won't be necessary," he said, his tone defiant. "I have the authority to handle this situation. You can wait longer if you'd like, or you can leave." Sarah let out a faint, humorless laugh. It wasn't a laugh of amusement but of someone who knew they had already won. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "But you, Daniels, might have to. I won't stand here and accept your abuse of power without involving your superior." Turning to Mike Carter, she asked, "Can you help me contact the head of security? I believe they'll want to review this situation." Mike glanced at Daniels, then back at Sarah, clearly torn. Finally, he nodded, pulling out his radio. Pressing the button, he spoke clearly into the device. "Captain Morales, please report to the main security checkpoint," Mike said. "We have a situation that requires your attention." Daniels' eyes widened in disbelief. "What the hell are you doing, Mike?" he demanded. "I told you I've got this under control." "No, Daniels," Mike replied, his voice steady. "You don't. And we can't let this situation spiral any further." Within minutes, Captain Morales arrived at the security area. The head of courthouse security had an air of authority that silenced the murmurs and brought order to the chaotic scene. He surveyed the situation. Daniels gripping Sarah's ID, the crowd of onlookers, and Sarah standing tall and composed. "What's going on here?" Morales asked, his voice calm yet commanding. Sarah stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Captain Morales, I'm Judge Sarah Monroe," she began. "I've been detained unnecessarily by Officer Daniels, despite my credentials being fully legitimate. I've requested your intervention to ensure his actions align with courthouse protocol." Morales turned to Daniels, his expression hardening. "Daniels," he said, his tone laced with disappointment, "is there an issue with Judge Monroe's ID?" Daniels stood frozen, feeling the weight of his own actions bearing down on him. The soft breeze of the evening swirled around them, carrying the distant hum of the city streets. Sarah Monroe remained silent, her gaze locked on him. For a moment, neither spoke, the tension between them palpable. Daniels shifted awkwardly, his hands still deep in his pockets. "Judge Monroe," he began again, his voice quieter, more measured this time, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say it in person. I've had time to reflect, and I realize how deeply I've failed in my duty, not just as an officer, but as a person." Sarah studied him carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity. She'd seen countless apologies before, some genuine, others mere performances. But there was something about Daniel's demeanor now, the way his shoulders slumped, the way his voice trembled slightly, that suggested he was grappling with more than just regret. "Why now?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Why are you standing here after the damage has already been done?" Daniels sighed, the weight of the day's events etched into his features. "I've been thinking about it nonstop. After Captain Morales suspended me, I realized I needed to confront my actions head on. No excuses. No justifications. Just the truth." Sarah uncrossed her arms and took a step closer, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. "The truth," she echoed. "And what is that truth, Officer Daniels?" He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and determination. The truth is that I let my biases cloud my judgment. I made assumptions based on appearances rather than facts. I've spent years in this job, and somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what it means to serve with integrity. Today, I was reminded of that in the hardest way possible. Sarah remained silent for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but she'd learned long ago that words alone weren't enough. Do you understand the gravity of what you did? She asked, her tone firm but not unkind. It wasn't just about disrespecting me. It was about the message your actions sent to everyone who witnessed them. The message that someone in a position of authority can abuse their power without consequence. That's not the kind of precedent I'm willing to let stand. Daniels nodded slowly. I understand that now. And I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions. Consequences are inevitable, Sarah said. But what matters most is what you do moving forward. How do you plan to ensure this never happens again? Daniels took a deep breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. I've already enrolled in bias awareness training, he said. I've spoken to Captain Morales about working with community outreach programs to rebuild trust. And I've taken it upon myself to mentor younger officers, to help them avoid making the same mistakes I did. Sarah arched an eyebrow. Those are good steps. But understand this, Daniels, it's a long road to redemption. One apology, one training session, isn't enough to undo years of ingrained behavior. It's a continuous process. I know, he said softly. And I'm willing to put in the work. The silence stretched between them again, but this time, it felt less strained. Sarah studied him once more, searching for any trace of arrogance or self-pity. Finding none, she nodded slightly. Very well, she said. Your actions moving forward will speak louder than any apology. Daniels looked relieved but remained humble. Thank you, Judge Monroe. I won't let you down again. Sarah offered a small nod before turning to unlock her car. As she opened the door, she glanced back at him one last time. Remember, Daniels, respect is earned through actions, not titles. He nodded solemnly. I understand. As Sarah drove away, the events of the day played over in her mind. The confrontation at the checkpoint, the murmurs in the courthouse, the tense trial, and now, Daniels' apology. Each moment had tested her resolve, her belief in justice, and her commitment to fairness. Back in the courthouse, Captain Morales stood by the security office window, watching the scene unfold in the parking lot below. He'd seen Daniels approach Sarah's car and had been curious to see how the conversation would play out. Now, as he watched Daniels walk back toward the building, he nodded to himself. Morales knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Daniels. The suspension was just the beginning. But if Daniels was serious about change, there might still be hope for redemption. Inside the courthouse, the whispers continued to circulate. Court staff, lawyers, and visitors exchanged stories about the morning's incident and the swift actions that followed. Many praised Judge Monroe's unwavering stance, her refusal to be intimidated. Others speculated about Daniel's future and whether he'd ever regain his position. In one corner of the lobby, a group of junior lawyers gathered, discussing the day's events. Did you see how composed Judge Monroe was? One of them said, admiration evident in her voice. She didn't let Daniel's behavior shake her. That's why she's one of the best, another added. She stands for justice, no matter what. In the midst of the chatter, an older lawyer, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. Justice isn't just about the courtroom, he said. It's about how we treat each other every day. Judge Monroe reminded us of that today. The group nodded in agreement, the weight of his words settling over them. Meanwhile, Sarah returned to her office to gather her belongings. The courthouse was nearly empty now, the day's proceedings having concluded. As she packed up her case files, she paused, reflecting on the trial and everything that had transpired. The trial of George Whitman had been significant, a reminder of the ongoing fight against corruption. But it was the incident with Daniels that lingered in her mind. It had exposed deeper issues within the system, issues that couldn't be ignored. Sarah knew her role extended beyond delivering verdicts in the courtroom. She was a symbol of fairness, integrity, and accountability. And with that came the responsibility to challenge biases and injustices wherever they arose. As she locked her office door and walked down the empty corridor, her footsteps echoed in the silence. The courthouse felt different now, as if the day's events had left an indelible mark on its walls. Outside, the night had fully descended, the sky dark and dotted with stars. Sarah took a deep breath, the cool air refreshing after the long day. As she walked toward her car, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Justice wasn't just about delivering sentences. It was about creating a culture of respect, fairness, and accountability. It was about standing up against discrimination and ensuring that everyone, regardless of their position or background, was treated with dignity. And Sarah Monroe was determined to continue that fight. In the courtroom, in the courthouse, and beyond. Though her expression remained firm, there was a slight softening in Sarah's gaze as she regarded Daniels. His words carried a note of sincerity that hadn't been present earlier, but her tone remained measured and resolute. "You say you want to change," she began, her voice steady. "But change doesn't come from words, Daniels. It comes from actions. What you do from this moment forward will define who you are, not this apology." Daniels nodded slowly, absorbing her words. His face reflected a mixture of regret and determination. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet but earnest. "I'll prove it through my actions. I don't expect your forgiveness now, but I hope that time will give me the chance to make things right." Sarah studied him for a moment, as if weighing the depth of his sincerity. Finally, she took a deep breath, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I hope you keep your promise, Daniels. Because if you don't, someone else will hold you accountable. Ensure that the next time you stand before someone like me, you treat them with the fairness and respect they deserve." Daniels lowered his head again, his shoulders sagging slightly as if burdened by the weight of his mistakes. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity," he said softly. "I won't let you down." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped past him, opened her car door, and slid inside. As she started the engine, her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. She saw Daniels still standing there, his figure solitary and forlorn under the dim glow of the parking lot lights. Gone was the arrogant posture he'd displayed that morning. Instead, he looked like a man grappling with his missteps, humbled by the weight of his actions. As her car rolled out of the parking lot, Sarah felt a faint sense of solace. She knew that change was a slow process. She didn't expect Daniels to transform overnight. But if there was one thing she believed in, it was the human capacity to learn from mistakes and grow. And if he didn't change, she knew that the system of justice she represented would be ready to hold him accountable. Driving home under the soft glow of city lights, Sarah's mind remained occupied with the confrontation and its broader implications. The incident at the security checkpoint that morning wasn't just a personal affront. It was a symptom of a much larger, systemic issue, one where prejudice and abuse of power persisted, sometimes in overt displays, but often in more subtle ways. When she arrived home, Sarah sat at her desk, her thoughts still racing. Before her lay a laptop and a stack of scattered notes, ideas for reforms and initiatives she'd considered in the past but never found time to pursue. With renewed resolve, she opened a new document and typed in bold letters: "Equitable justice, combating discrimination and bias in the legal system." Over the next few days, Sarah worked tirelessly to draft a comprehensive plan aimed at addressing the very issues highlighted by the incident with Daniels. She proposed initiatives that would not only educate courthouse staff on unconscious bias but also establish mechanisms to hold individuals accountable for discriminatory behavior. When the proposal was complete, Sarah convened an internal meeting at the courthouse. She invited judges, lawyers, and administrative staff to participate, ensuring that every voice in the building had the opportunity to contribute to the discussion. In the spacious meeting room, groups of attendees sat quietly, awaiting her words. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her sharp, confident gaze sweeping across the crowd. "What happened at the security checkpoint wasn't an isolated incident," she began, her voice steady and resonant. "It reflects a larger issue that we must confront: the persistence of bias and abuse of authority within our system. These issues cannot be ignored. If we fail to address them, we are failing in our mission to uphold justice for everyone." The room remained silent for a moment. Some attendees nodded in agreement, while others avoided her gaze, uncomfortable with the topic at hand. Sarah pressed on, undeterred. "I'm not here to single out any individual or apply undue pressure on anyone," she continued. "I'm here to say that if we don't address this issue head on, we are complicit in perpetuating it. We have a responsibility not only to enforce the law but to ensure that everyone who enters this courthouse is treated with fairness and respect, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or what they look like. As her words hung in the air, Sarah concluded her speech with a proposal for regular discussions on unconscious bias and discrimination within the courthouse. She suggested the creation of a new code of conduct that would monitor staff behavior more closely, ensuring that no one could abuse their authority without facing consequences. Her words were met with scattered applause. Several judges and lawyers approached her afterward to express their support. While some remained hesitant, wary of change, the groundwork had been laid for meaningful reform. Not long after, Sarah was invited to appear on a television program to discuss her initiatives. Seated in a formal studio, she recounted the incident at the security checkpoint, framing it as a reflection of broader societal issues rather than a personal grievance. When I entered the courthouse that day, she said, looking directly into the camera, I wasn't just a judge. I was a black woman confronting the biases that still exist in our society. That experience wasn't just hurtful on a personal level, it eroded public trust in our legal system. And that's something we can't afford to let happen. The interviewer leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. What steps are you taking to address this issue? He asked. Sarah smiled slightly, her eyes radiating determination. We've launched a series of initiatives within our courthouse, she explained. It's not just about educating staff on unconscious bias, it's about implementing practical reforms. We need regular training, transparent monitoring systems, and safe channels for reporting misconduct without fear of retaliation. The interview quickly gained traction across social media and major news outlets. Sarah's story became a focal point of public discussion, garnering widespread support from both colleagues and the general public. Back at the courthouse, Sarah's proposal for reform was formally submitted to the leadership team. Her comprehensive plan included several key elements. Mandatory unconscious bias training. All courthouse staff, from security guards to judges, would be required to participate in periodic training to recognize and address biases in their work. Transparent reporting system. A secure and confidential process would be established for employees or the public to report incidents of misconduct without fear of retaliation. Independent Oversight Committee. An impartial panel composed of legal and social experts would be tasked with investigating complaints of bias and discrimination. Enhanced internal monitoring. Closer scrutiny would be applied to staff behavior, particularly in sensitive situations like security checks, to ensure accountability. After extensive discussions, the courthouse leadership approved Sarah's reforms, beginning with a pilot program. The initial sessions were met with both curiosity and apprehension. Judges, lawyers, and courthouse employees participated in open discussions, sharing their own experiences with bias and abuse of power within the legal system. Daniels attended one of these sessions as part of a mandated improvement plan. He remained mostly silent throughout but appeared deeply engaged in the discussions. When his turn to speak came, he stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly. I allowed my biases to affect how I did my job, he admitted, his voice low but steady. I'm learning to recognize those biases and correct them. Seated across from him, Sarah's gaze softened slightly, though it retained its characteristic authority. She knew that real change was a long process, but seeing Daniels take the first steps toward accountability gave her hope. During a speech at a national legal conference, Sarah delivered a powerful message to her peers. Justice isn't just what happens inside the courtroom. Justice is how we treat one another, how we build a system that holds everyone accountable while ensuring fairness and respect for all. Though her expression remained firm, Sarah's voice carried an air of gravity that silenced the room. You say you want change, she said, her tone steady and resolute. But change doesn't come from words, Daniels. It comes from actions. Her gaze remained locked on Daniels, unwavering. What you do from this moment forward will define who you are, not this apology. Daniels nodded, his face a mixture of regret and determination. I understand, he said, his voice low. I'll prove it through my actions. I don't expect your forgiveness now, but I hope time will give me the chance to make things right. Sarah remained silent for a moment, her eyes studying him as if trying to discern whether his words carried true intent. Finally, she took a deep breath, her gaze never wavering. I hope you keep your promise, Daniels, she said. Because if you don't, Someone else will hold you accountable. Ensure that the next time you stand before someone like me, you treat them with the fairness and respect they deserve. Daniels lowered his head, absorbing her words with solemnity. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, he said softly. I won't let you down. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She stepped past Daniels, opened her car door, and slid into the driver's seat. Before starting the engine, she glanced into the rearview mirror, seeing Daniels still standing there, his figure solitary under the dim lights of the parking lot. Gone was his usual arrogance. Instead, he looked like a man carrying the weight of his missteps. As her car rolled out of the parking lot, Sarah felt a faint sense of solace. She knew that change was a long process, and she didn't expect Daniels to transform overnight. But if there was one thing she believed in, it was the human capacity to learn from mistakes and grow. And if he didn't, Sarah, along with the system of justice she represented, would be ready to remind him. Driving through the city streets, Sarah's mind remained occupied with the confrontation and the broader implications it symbolized. The incident at the security checkpoint was not just a personal affront. It was a symptom of a systemic issue where prejudice and abuse of power persisted, both overtly and subtly. As a judge and a representative of justice, Sarah knew she had to act. Not just to reclaim fairness for herself but to initiate meaningful change within the system. When she arrived home, Sarah sat down at her desk. Her laptop and scattered notes about initiatives she had considered but never pursued lay before her. She opened a new document and typed in bold letters, "Equitable justice, combating discrimination and bias in the legal system." A few days later, Sarah convened an internal meeting at the courthouse, inviting judges, lawyers, and administrative staff to participate. In the spacious meeting room, groups of attendees sat quietly, awaiting her words. When Sarah stepped forward, her sharp, confident gaze swept across the room. What happened at the security checkpoint wasn't an isolated incident, Sarah began, her voice steady and resonant. It reflects an issue we must confront: the persistence of bias and abuse of authority within our system. These issues cannot be ignored. The room remained silent. Some attendees nodded in agreement, while others looked down, avoiding Sarah's penetrating gaze. I'm not here to single out any individual or apply undue pressure on anyone, she continued. I'm here to say that if we fail to address this issue, we are failing in our mission to uphold justice for everyone. She scanned the room, making eye contact with several attendees. We have a responsibility not only to enforce the law but to ensure that everyone feels respected and treated fairly when they enter this courthouse, no matter who they are, where they come from, or what they look like. Sarah concluded her speech with a proposal to organize regular discussions on unconscious bias and how to address discrimination in the legal environment. She also suggested creating a new code of conduct to monitor the behavior of courthouse staff, ensuring that no one could abuse their authority without consequences. Her words were met with scattered applause. Several judges and lawyers approached her afterward, expressing their support. Some remained hesitant, but the initial groundwork for change had been laid. Not long after, Sarah was invited to appear in a television interview. Seated in a formal studio, she recounted the incident at the checkpoint, shifting the focus from Daniels to the broader issue: the necessity for a truly equitable justice system. When I entered the courthouse that day, she said, looking directly into the camera, I wasn't just a judge. I was a black woman confronting the biases that still exist in our society. That experience not only hurt me but also eroded public trust in our legal system. The interviewer leaned forward, asking, so what do you plan to do to address this? Sarah smiled slightly, her eyes radiating determination. I've launched an initiative in our courthouse, she said. It's not just about education but practical reform. We need regular training for staff, transparent monitoring systems, and safe channels for reporting misconduct without fear of retaliation. The interview quickly gained traction on social media and major news outlets. Sarah's story became a focal point of public discussion, garnering widespread support. With backing from her colleagues and the public, Sarah submitted a formal reform proposal to the courthouse leadership. After extensive discussions, the courthouse leadership approved the reforms, beginning with a pilot program. The initial discussions held at Sarah's courthouse quickly spread to other institutions. Employees, lawyers, and even young judges participated, sharing their experiences with bias and abuse of power in their work. Sarah listened attentively to every story, from minor incidents to egregious misconduct. Daniels also attended one of the sessions as part of a mandated improvement plan. He remained mostly silent but appeared deeply engaged. When his turn came to speak, he admitted, "I allowed unconscious bias to affect how I did my job. I'm learning to recognize and correct that." Seated across from him, Sarah's gaze softened slightly but retained its authority. She knew the path to change wasn't easy, but Daniels had taken the first step. Months after Daniels completed the training program, a major event was held at the courthouse to celebrate the progress of the reform movement Sarah had initiated. The event, a conference on justice and equality, attracted judges, lawyers, social activists, and staff from courthouses across the state. As Sarah walked past Daniels' seat after her keynote speech, he stood and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "What you've said and what you've done has helped me see the changes I need to make. I'm still learning, but I'm trying." Sarah took his hand, her gaze softening further. "Change doesn't happen in a day, Daniels. But the fact that you've started and are committed to it is what matters most. Keep going." Standing outside the courthouse after the event, Sarah looked up at the sky, now darkening into a deep blue. She knew her work wasn't just a small step in reforming the system, it was a reminder of what justice truly meant. It wasn't just about delivering the right verdicts. It was about creating an environment where everyone was treated fairly and with kindness. And with that belief, she continued her journey, one focused on fairness, accountability, and respect, knowing that each step she took contributed to a more just society.